on the Facebook page. And actually, Collin is going to be talking about 10th Street, which is that right, Collin? And the largest preserved freedmen's town in the country, I believe. So Jessica is going to be monitoring the chat. So if y'all have questions as Collin and I are going through, please put that in the chat. And then if I forget to ask, Jessica is going to flag me and make sure you get your questions answered. What we're going to do is we are going to kind of walk through the structure of the book, and Collin's going to give us some additional background. And then at the end, especially the last 15 minutes, we want to address what can we do today to prevent these types of things from happening again? How can we be better informed citizens and do a better job, not just in our neighborhoods, but in the city of Dallas, looking at it as our larger neighborhood and supporting all of our neighbors and supporting our city. So with that, I would love to introduce Collin Yarbrough, and he wrote Paved Away: Infrastructure, Policy, and Racism in an American City. If you're not muted, I'm going to ask you to mute. And I'm trying to go to active speaker. So Collin, can you give us a brief introduction about yourself and what influenced you to write Paved Away?
Yeah, first of all, thank you all for having me. It's when I am a Lake Highlands resident. I grew up in Moss Haven, Forest Meadow area. So when I first started writing this, I was like, I very much want all of the people who live in my neighborhood to know about this, because it seems very far away in a lot of aspects, because it's easy to get sucked into just like Highlands, and that's by design. So a lot of this journey started last year around February. But to give a little bit of background on me, I spent the first 8 years of my career after graduating from college as a pipeline engineer for Atmos Energy. So I was doing utility work, mostly in Fort Worth and areas west. I lived in Lubbock for a little bit, so a lot of infrastructure, building pipelines, doing land deals, that kind of stuff. So that's kind of my background. But my mother and I also run a nonprofit cookie bakery out of our home. And so that was a lot of the impetus for me to leave Atmos in 2019, where I ended up starting at seminary here at SMU in the fall of 2019. And it was in the process of being at seminary that kind of led me away from seminary. I was learning a lot of stuff in Old Testament and church and social context classes, and people had recommended some classes over the engineering department to me. And the first class I took was Context and Impact of Design. And that class was life-changing, to say the least. And in that class, we looked at the ways that the built environment, chairs, playground equipment, all of these things that are designed in our everyday lives, and how those items impact our daily lives. And so that's where we started to look at things like St. Louis and housing projects in St. Louis. And things began to sort of gel with these ideas of justice and things like that I was kind of learning in my seminary studies. And when it came to writing the paper for the class, kind of the final paper, it had to be on a design element in Dallas. And one of those items on the list of things we could potentially choose from was Central Expressway. And I didn't really think much about it. It's a highway I used every day. It's right here next to campus. I'm sure y'all use Central and probably yell at it a lot, just like I do. And didn't really think much about it. And until I started researching, I found a New York Times article from the 90s when they expanded it to what it looks like today. And in the process of that expansion, they moved the bodies of 1,127 formerly enslaved people to make space for the highway to dig down. And that's between Lemon and Hall. So if you go on the walking tour of the Freedmen Memorial on Saturday, that's the very place I'm talking about. That's the same cemetery. So you'll be walking in the same place that I'm talking about right now. And I couldn't get over the fact that we would disturb Black bodies to make space for a highway. And the more I kept digging and looking around, no pun intended, at all the other highways surrounding downtown, Woodall, Rogers, I-345, 35, 45, every single highway had a neighborhood and a story attached to it of displacement, primarily of communities of color or low-income neighborhoods. And that was too much for the paper. And so my professor joked, he's like, hey, you should turn this into a book. And so I did. And that's kind of the genesis and the birth of what we have today is the Paved Way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that you start your book off talking about and honoring the indigenous people that occupied the land that today we call Dallas, Texas. Can you share with our members what land acknowledgement is for indigenous people and why that's important and what might that look like for Dallas?
Yeah. So land acknowledgement is this reminder of the long history of occupation on these lands. And it allows us to be present in this space today and open up an understanding of these places within that history. So when we call out the names of the Caddo, the Wichita, the Comanche, and other nations that have stewarded this land for centuries, it's not a historical or past tense thing. This is still a present day occupation and acknowledgement of that act of colonialism in these unceded indigenous lands. They are not dead. They are still here with us, standing right here in our city. And so it's an acknowledgement of that past and that present at the same time, that this is still an ongoing thing. And the hope is that that begins to open up reflection about what that means. And so getting engaged with American Indian groups here in Dallas, there are lots of them. Peggy Larney and Jody Voice Yellowfish are two names I highly recommend following the work that they do. And eventually that starts to move towards the discussion of returning the land and what does that look like for the city of Dallas and things like that. And yeah, it's an uncomfortable conversation, but it's the beginning of reconciling with that piece of our history that is often left out of Dallas history books.
Thank you. So you move from the indigenous communities into kind of the core issues that you uncovered, and you gave us the background of how you started doing this research of how Black and Brown communities were impacted. So it started out with the building of what at the time was Central Boulevard, and then that became Central Expressway. And in your book, you talk about the community that was disrupted was a Black community called North Dallas, probably not what we think of as North Dallas today, but what was called North Dallas. And the thing I found was shocking was that you said that there were about 16,000 Black people that lived in this area. And once the boulevard came through and then expanded into the expressway, that shrunk to 1,500 people. So where did they go?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot of people to move in that time frame.
It is. And that didn't happen all at once.
Okay.
But it did happen between about 1950 to 1980, you see that loss. And then that's when you start to see Uptown show up, is after that point. But they went south and west because there was nowhere else to go. That is segregation made it a viable option to build a highway through because the land values were lower, because there weren't services, and the land values were, lack of permits, all of these little things that lead to degrading housing quality. And it was actually a high percentage of home ownership. So not only was it a displacement of people, but it was also a displacement of Black wealth in the city. And when people tried to move south, there were a lot of bombings. That's part of Dallas's history. There's a lot of bombings in South Dallas, especially in the 50s, and even some times before then, whenever Black people were trying to move, they had nowhere else to go because housing shortages. And eventually they just either left. There was white flight around the same time, because once you have the highway in, then you start to see areas like Highlands popping up. And so that creates opportunities for white people to leave. They have other options. So Black people move to South Dallas, they move west, and even kind of in, I think, 53 or 54, Hamilton Park opens up. The city created Hamilton Park to alleviate the bombings that were going on. So even within, the own context of our own neighborhood of Lake Highlands, we have some of that history as well.
What was most shocking to you? Because you started off with your research paper looking at Central Expressway, and then you expanded from there. So, but with Central Expressway, what was the most shocking? There's a lot of shocking things, but like, what really stuck with you?
It was probably when I went back and I was able to look at the big archaeological reports that came out of that. So after they'd spent these 4 years excavating, doing archaeological records, and then reinterring all of these bodies further to the west in the cemetery, they produced these incredible books that have all of the graves lined out, and they have the historical overlay of where the original Lemon Avenue and the original Central Expressway service roads and other things were. And so you can see overlaid on top of the locations of all the graves that they reinterred, you can see the boundaries of where all of the roads and infrastructure was on top of these bodies. And it's hundreds of graves literally covered up underneath the highway for almost 50 years. And it's one of those things where it's like, you read the story, the New York Times article, and you're like, wow, that's crazy. But then when you actually see them laid out on a map, and you can see physically all of these places that I've now walked over, and I'm like, and with my background of construction, understanding what would have had to have happened to build those roads and to do some of that work, and just thinking about what that would have looked like, it was just, from an engineering perspective and from a personal perspective, it was really haunting to think about what it looks like to just disturb a cemetery like that without even
the disrespect.
Yeah.
And the disregard.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You move from Central Expressway to talking about Deep Ellum, and I'm guilty like you are now. I probably went to Deep Ellum several years before you did. So I went there in the 90s, and for us it was a nightclub scene and some restaurants and that type of thing. One of the things that I thought that struck me the most in that chapter was that you shared that prior to 1916 there wasn't actually lawful segregation. So Dallas actively codified segregation legally in 1916. So before that, were the white and black businesses mixed? Were they integrated, or were they still separated?
Yeah, they were actually, it was interesting when I didn't necessarily pick up on it when I went to the African American History Museum down at Fair Park. Um, and it wasn't until I had an interview with Alan Govinar. He's an author of the book Deep Ellum Blues. And we were talking, and that's when he pointed out to me, he's like, you noticed all of those addresses because they have a 1910 Negro business directory. And it's like all on along one wall, and they have all these pages. And at the time, I didn't have my block numbers down, so I didn't necessarily know where certain blocks were in downtown. But he said a lot of the black businesses were in the heart of downtown, further west, closer to the courthouse and places like that. And he said, but after 1916, you see everything shifts to the east, to North Dallas and Deep Ellum, and those areas where those are the only places that black people could have homes or have businesses and things like that. And you did see some mixing in Deep Ellum. It was a unique area because some of the white Jewish businesses would cater to black customers and things like that you wouldn't necessarily see in other parts of the town or parts of Dallas. So there was a little bit of mixing in Deep Ellum, but still highly segregated after 19.
So Deep Ellum was mainly a black neighborhood, black businesses. How did the railroads? So sometimes we think about railroads and infrastructure is not a good thing, but in this case, it seemed like the railroads helped Deep Ellum grow. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And it's kind of a revelation for me as well. And keep in mind that railroads were different at that time. They didn't necessarily have a lot of the space that they had. You could walk right over the tracks, things like that. It was a pretty low bar and a low barrier compared to what railroads are today. But they were these massive engines for black wealth creation and home settlement and all these things because they were the hands building the railroads. Similarly with Little Mexico, Mexican hands were coming up and building railroads through their neighborhood, and that spawned a lot of their housing creation in Little Mexico as well. And as you have those houses build up, literally right next to the railroads, everything kind of grows out from that. And then once you have the concentration of people, then you start to have more businesses and other things that have to support all those people. So they really were these massive engines for black life and black culture, which is fascinating, and that happened across the country.
Okay, so Black Deep Ellum is growing and developing. And then in the 1920s, there was a writer for the Dallas Morning News named William Ward. And he started writing some pretty nasty articles that were dehumanizing and really devalued the Black Deep Ellum neighborhood. Can you speak to that? And how has that perpetuated lower home values for Black Dallasites today, starting back in the 1920s with journalists?
Yeah. I think, because he's just following the caricatures and the narratives that are prevalent at the time. So it's hard for me to single necessarily, as much as I want to demonize William Ward sometimes. And I'm not very nice in the book. But it's just, he is simply reflecting the dominant culture and the norms at the time. So it's really this insight into how white Dallas viewed Black Dallasites. They're very much these caricatures. I mean, the cartoons that are in at least that article, that I mean, it's very much what you would expect, the oversized lips and just all the stereotypical things you might expect from Jim Crow era cartoons. And what that translates to, and Andre Perry of the Brookings Institute did a fantastic study on Black real estate values across the country. And I think this was in 2019. And he found that because of segregation and racial bias, Black homeowners across the United States have lost $156 billion in lost value because of segregation and racial bias. And so what that means for Dallas is we have a lot, because we are still a very segregated city, and those were the neighborhoods that saw greater home value losses and less upward mobility. And so what that means for Dallas is, it means, one, we have lower tax bases because we've devalued land artificially. Two, it means a significant portion of our population is less upwardly mobile than they would otherwise be, because we've segregated neighborhoods and devalued their homes, so we've minimized wealth creation. So nobody wins. It's we treat it like a zero-sum game, but in that fact, everybody loses. So Dallas is not better off by any stretch because of it.
Right, right. Do you think that, or have you observed if journalists in Dallas today, or other political figures or leaders, are they still using language as a weapon?
Yes. I think it's getting, on a whole, it's getting better. I think it depends on the news outlet. Obviously, they all have their own agendas, so there's definitely variation. But I think on a whole, I'd like to believe that we're better than we were. But one issue I still see is this use of deficit-based language rather than asset-based language. So talking about somewhere as being poverty-stricken or a high-crime neighborhood tends to still dominate the narratives. In fact, I was listening to a podcast this morning, and the reporter was talking about Mexico and talking about how basically implying that Mexico is not safe. And my immediate reaction was, well, is that all of Mexico, or is that certain pockets of Mexico? Like, what is the context behind that? You can't just continue to perpetuate this statement that Mexico as a whole is not safe, just like you can't say Dallas is not safe because there was a shooting in Hamilton Park on July 4th. And so perpetuating those deficit-based narratives tends to overwhelm any sort of asset-based language that could possibly describe a neighborhood more accurately. And yeah, so I think there's still some movement that can be made there towards more asset-based language rather than some of the others.
Thank you. I'm going to pause for a moment and check in with Jessica to see if we have any questions from our members.
No, not right now. I think we're just all very much intrigued with the discussion.
Thank you. All right. So, Collin, we were talking about Deep Ellum and how it was very different when it was Black Deep Ellum to what we've experienced today. But yet today it is not Black Deep Ellum, right? It's very different. So, can you talk about how? So the railroads came in and helped make it prosperous, and then it seems that the railroads left, and then expressways were built that really cut through Deep Ellum. So can you speak to that and how we lost Deep Ellum as a Black neighborhood?
Yeah, and that's kind of this double-edged sword of the railroad, is once you take it away and replace it with a highway, it no longer becomes an easy barrier to just walk over. It's a lot harder to walk across a 6-lane highway than it is to walk over a couple of train tracks. And so also in that process, aside from it being a physical barrier between downtown and Deep Ellum, it also required more space. As I said a little bit earlier, a lot of these homes and businesses in the area they kind of call Stringtown, which was this kind of connecting line between North Dallas, kind of uptown and Deep Ellum. And that demolished all of the Black businesses that were along the railroad track to make space for the highway. So you not only have the effects in the North Dallas neighborhood as it cuts through, but you also have this destruction in this area of Stringtown that's kind of this western border for Deep Ellum. And so what happens is you lose all of these businesses, and with that, people no longer have stable jobs. They have to find other places to go. And so people leave because there's nothing left, because it's all been destroyed by the highway. And then you come back again, 20, 30 years later, and you build I-345 through it, and you take up more space. And at that point, there was almost nothing left, which then leaves you with abandoned buildings, which has typically lower land values, which makes it a real estate developer's dream to come back in and redevelop. And that's what you see in the 80s and the 90s with the revitalization, kind of the second and third lives of Deep Ellum. Rock and club scene, Club Dada, all those kinds of places start to pop up. And then we have kind of the third iteration, which is Deep Ellum today.
Yep. So similar to Deep Ellum, there was a Mexican community called Little Mexico. So how is it similar to Deep Ellum?
In a lot of ways, kind of like I mentioned, the railroads were a big factor in the creation of Little Mexico. And in some other ways, it was also a predominantly Jewish neighborhood beforehand, before the Mexican Revolution, which brought a lot of Mexican.
Getting some dinner.
Give me about 20 minutes and we'll have broccoli.
Roseanne, can we mute? Can we mute, please?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
So you see a lot of movement up from after the Mexican Revolution. And so you have this kind of boundary area intermingling of Jewish and Mexican immigrants. And again, at the time, Jewish immigrants not viewed as they would be today. So a little bit more kind of okay, if you will, for there to be more intermingling at the time. But eventually they moved south for bigger homes for their families. And so you had the railroads, and you had these small business districts pop up. So in a lot of ways, the development was very similar to Deep Ellum. And then the demise was similar as well. You have a highway, Harry Hines, widens, cuts right through the middle of the neighborhood. The Dallas North Tollway was kind of the last nail in the coffin.
So yeah, in the book you talk about that. I guess I would call it almost a fading of the community, right? So there were also zoning changes going on in addition to the infrastructure. So how did the lack of representation by the Mexican community impact them? And at the time, did they even have the right or the ability to have representation? So today, everyone, supposedly has the right to representation. But at the time that this was happening, how did that lack of representation and having a voice impact them?
It was huge. I think it was 1970 was the first year that Anita Martinez, she was the first Mexican American to serve on Dallas City Council. And I think just a year or two before that was George Allen, who was the first person of color to serve on City Council. So you think about all the history that happened up until that point. There was a lot of development and things that happened before that time, and not having a voice was massive. You had no grounds for recourse because the city council could ignore you. In theory, you know, the at-large, and even then it was an at-large representation. It wasn't a physical district like we have today, our 13 or 14-1 districting. It was at large. And so even then you didn't have any real direct kind of representation like for your neighborhood. And so that plays out in the city plan commission for zoning and other things like that, which is really difficult. Like when you have nowhere for your voice to go, then you just keep in Little Mexico's, you know, case, they kept fighting for as long as they could until there was just nothing left. Because they were beaten out by real estate developers and other white business interests that came in and took control of the land and forced everybody out.
Is it your observation, are minority neighborhoods better represented today? Do you feel that they have more of a voice? And I can certainly also ask the members on the call who are BIPOC members if you feel that there is better representation today. Jessica's shaking her head no.
Yeah, I agree with Jessica. I would say visually, is there greater representation? Yes, there are more people of color on city council than there were in 1970. But the city council is still controlled by white business interests in Dallas and real estate developers. And so as long as they continue to hold the strings, you know, we don't have the Dallas Citizens, you know, the Dallas Citizens Council doesn't hold nearly the same power that it used to. But as long as we continue to have those concentrations of power in predominantly white businesses and those kinds of things, then we will continue to have rampant inequality in our city. Just because we have a Black mayor doesn't mean anything. And many of the Black residents of Dallas I've talked to are not fans of Mayor Johnson. He was silent on Shingle Mountain and a whole lot of other issues that are affecting South and West Dallas. He's very quiet about. And as I think that says everything we need to know about.
I know Dallas has kind of a very strange setup compared to other cities. So we have a city manager that has more power than the mayor. And a lot of people don't know that, but it's my understanding, isn't the city manager also Black?
He is, yeah. T.C. Broadnax is.
Okay, that's right. That's his name. Like, right? Like, I don't even know his name. Like, that's embarrassing because it's like I'm behind the scenes and everybody look at the mayor, but the mayor is really just another city council person with an extra title almost.
Yeah.
Is that? I learned that in Girl Scouts this year. And before that, I've lived in Dallas like 30 plus years and did not know that our mayor really doesn't have a lot of authority. So with the city manager position, you know, are there things that he should be doing from a representative perspective, and or how is he and the council impacted by these white interests? Like, how can we make this better? Because that's one of the things we're trying to learn today, is not just here's this history and it's really frustrating, but how do we stop the perpetuation?
Yeah, and that's, you know, that's the $1 billion question.
You're supposed to have answers.
I don't know if I have any silver bullet answer for that. But what I have seen work, at least within, I'll say the past council and manager, just because we're very new into our new council. So I don't necessarily know exactly how everything's going to play out with some of the changes that have been made. But the past council and city manager have been very receptive to neighborhood pressure and media pressure. It's been a very effective tool for getting change in the city of Dallas. Short of zoning law changes, serious equity and environmental equity issues being taken up, short of those actual structural changes in our policies and the ways that things procedurally play out, I think pressure on city council is still hands down one of the most effective ways to advocate for change in the city.
Okay. So let's talk about 10th Street.
Okay.
So can you explain what a freedman's town is, and then kind of give a little bit of background about 10th Street and what is left of it, and the value in preserving and maintaining that?
Sure. So freedman's town, just generally speaking, is they're settlements or areas that people who were formerly enslaved came to and settled after the end of the Civil War. A very loose definition, but that's pretty much sums it up. 10th Street is one of many freedmen's towns that existed in Dallas. North Dallas was a freedmen's town. Little Egypt, which is kind of around the old skating rink, White Rock Coffee, that area. There's a freedmen's town there. So there are lots of them that popped up around Dallas. But 10th Street, which is down kind of East Oak Cliff, so east of I-35, south of the Trinity River, was settled by the Boswell family. I can't remember the exact date off the top of my head. And it just began to grow as there was a panic in the late 1800s, and white landowners were selling off land to anybody just to get rid of it and make ends meet and all those kinds of things. There's this huge surge in this freedmen's town, especially there in 10th Street. And so you have this massive community build up in that area. And it was much like North Dallas or Deep Ellum, massive business district along kind of Jefferson Avenue. And 10th Street, kind of where the Tag magnet school is down there, that's in the 10th Street neighborhood. And so you saw this massive neighborhood blossom and flourish, obviously within the kind of the strictures of segregation. And then the same story. Highway comes through, mid 1950s. I-35 comes right through the neighborhood, right along the western edge, separates it, goes right through the business district, and separates it from West Oak Cliff. And in the process, you lose a lot of those small businesses. So it's that same story again. You lose small businesses, some people just decide to move and leave altogether, and you start to see the fraying of the neighborhood. And so that piece is very similar to other neighborhoods in Dallas, Black neighborhoods and Mexican-American neighborhoods in Dallas. But the piece that's different is that 10th Street was able to get a historic designation and kind of protect itself, whereas North Dallas was already gone. There's like nothing left. Same thing with Little Mexico, almost entirely gone, except for a few plaques here and there. So 10th Street was able to get some of that historic designation, which kind of stemmed the tide of demolitions. And you saw a lot of those same zoning things where people would come in, they would buy land, change the zoning, demolish the house, and then put up something else. And so the historic designation kind of saved 10th Street a little bit, but it didn't protect it entirely. And what we're seeing today is there was a demolition ordinance put in place. And what it did was it basically said, because 10th Street has deteriorated, a lot of the homes are abandoned and vacant. And a lot of what happens, especially in Freedmanstown type land deals, is it's very difficult to find heirs when you have an abandoned home. So trying to save a property is very difficult because that title of ownership trail is very difficult to track down. You have multiple heirs, and so it can get pretty difficult. And so what you have is you have a lot of vacant homes. And these are sometimes described as nuisance structures. And so what the city of Dallas did was create a policy where homes that are under 3,000 square feet and are deemed a nuisance can be scheduled for accelerated demolition in a historic district. And for context, no Black or Latinx historic district has a structure larger than 3,000 square feet, has a home larger than 3,000 square feet.
So it's very targeted.
Yes, very targeted. And so when you think about places like Swiss Avenue, Winnetka Heights, all of these other places that are predominantly white historic districts, the homes are larger. And so they're not subject to the same accelerated demolition policies. And so what you have is just accelerated demolition in areas like 10th Street. And so what was once the most intact Freedmanstown is just hanging on by a thread because the homes are getting demolished constantly. And you see that happen. There's this great research done by BC Workshop. They're an architecture and urban planning firm here in Dallas that they did a lot of work with the 10th Street neighborhood. And they put out this report and it just shows all of the homes over the decades. And you just see it from like 1970 and 80, and they just disappear. And the whole area becomes almost vacant up to about 2010. And the city of Dallas has put in some measures to kind of stem that tide a little bit, but the measure still stands. So nuisance, the under 3,000 square foot nuisance kind of ordinance and policy is still there. And so that's a really good example of, outside of pressure, that's still a policy that exists in the city of Dallas that is wholly inequitable and racialized. And unless we can get those things fixed, then we're going to continue to see that area cleared out. And that's right next to the I-35 deck park. So the neighbors are worried about that.
Right. So I want to rewind a minute.
Yeah.
Because we were talking about 10th Street as this thriving Black community. And as you were talking, I thought about the Tulsa Massacre that has many of us only learned about, in the last few years, because again, it was hidden. And so while building 35 through 10th Street was not the same as this horrific attack that happened in the Tulsa neighborhood that devastated the Black town there, it feels very targeted. And I'm wondering if your research showed it all. Was it not just, well, this land has lower value and we can use eminent domain, but are you aware of anyone politically at the time that this happened that was using it as a weapon? There is this thriving Black community, and we as white people don't like that. So how can we destroy it? We're not going to destroy it like they did in Tulsa, with bombs and hangings and attacks and the horrificness of that. But the end result is the same. It's been decimated. So are you aware of any more like kind of a nefarious approach to the implementation of 35?
Yeah. I guess fortunate or unfortunately, I'm not aware. Part of that is because while writing this during the pandemic, getting access to city archival material was very difficult. So pulling city council minutes and things like that were very difficult. So my second edition is going to have much deeper dives into those city documents. So I may find something in the future, but I will say this: Jefferson was kind of the dividing line at the time, still kind of is in a lot of ways. And so from an engineering perspective, if I'm looking at trying to route something, whether it's a pipeline or a highway, I'm going to take the path of least resistance and whichever's cheaper. And so if I'm trying to make a route south, I'm definitely not going to go through the white neighborhood because that's going to be a political nightmare. It's going to be very difficult to do. I have this parkland. There's a baseball field and park on the east side of Jefferson. And so I'm like, well, I can go through there because that's city-owned land, and I, city, am buying all the land for this highway anyways. So I can just give myself that land and give myself an inlet to the south. And then to avoid having to do major overhauls to Jefferson Avenue, I'm then going to take the route that wraps around Jefferson and avoid having major city infrastructure being impacted. And so that's kind of the the colorblind approach to engineering. They're like, well, no, there was no racial bias in any of this. And you're like, well, sure, I guess, but you actively made choices that directly targeted and impacted areas that were Black. So explicitly nefarious, I haven't found anything, but implicitly nefarious, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. So let's talk about corn dogs, right? So a lot of us go to Fair Park maybe once a year to go to the State Fair of Texas. And then we don't think about it, and yet the creation of Fair Park through eminent domain and spot zoning really hurt the people that lived in that area. Can you speak to how eminent domain and spot zoning was abused and how it's impacted the population around Fair Park and what is still ongoing today? Because I know there's a lot of issues still in that area.
Yeah. So eminent domain in the context of Fair Park, it was kind of it was a strategic play. The city of Dallas made a very strategic play in Fair Park in the late 60s, early 70s. They were looking to do an expansion, and they knew they were going to need land for that. So they created zones on city maps and wrote in no permits issued in this area. And what that did was create areas in the Black neighborhoods. This is kind of the southeast-ish area of Fair Park. And so that drove land prices down because nobody could get a construction permit to do any improvements. And they held a focus group, which said, we got a bunch of white citizens of Dallas, basically all agreed that they were really uncomfortable that there were Black people surrounding Fair Park. And if you could create a buffer and get rid of them and make a paved parking lot, we'd feel a lot more comfortable and maybe we'd come to Fair Park more. And that's like official record stuff. No sugarcoating that. And And so the city of Dallas followed through with that. They, by lowering the value of the land, by not allowing it to be improved, they then came through with eminent domain and purchased up the land for the parking lots. And the real kicker here is then not providing the same fair market value for white and black landowners. And in some cases, giving 3 times as much to white homeowners who lived in Park Cities and North Dallas. And the black homeowners living next door, same exact house, getting 25, 50 cents to the dollar. And they took them to court. They did not win. They were able to pressure city council to get somewhat higher fair market value, quote unquote. But it was nowhere near what was needed to fully compensate for the relocation and loss. And what you have is this you're left with this disenfranchised neighborhood on the edge of something that nobody goes down to except once a year. And so I think Jim Schutze had this really great quote. He's like, Fair Park is the only park he knows of that actually has a negative effect on property values, whereas all other parks are a positive thing for neighborhoods.
Right.
Fair Park becomes this thing that's a negative. It's an anchor for the neighborhood, and it just drags it down. And so they're still buying up land. Spectra is still buying land and demolishing houses around Fair Park as recently as a couple of years ago. So they're still doing the same thing that they were doing in the 70s.
Right. So is the eminent domain purchases, or these purchases that are going on, again, part of that $150+ billion loss to the Black community in wealth and building of wealth, because you're not recovering that. So now you have less money and now you can't even afford a house.
Exactly. Yep. That's exactly right. And so then you get into this situation where if you have a lower home value, and you get pushed out, you have nowhere to go. And there's similar stories that are going on in West Dallas as Trinity Groves is pushing further west. The Mexican American Latinx neighborhoods over there are feeling that exact same pressure.
Right. I'm going to pause for a moment and check in with Jessica. Any questions in chat?
No.
Okay, if anyone has questions, again, feel free to drop those in chat and we will keep going here. So we talked about this a little bit, but I wanted you to get a little bit deeper for us. So we talked about city council and pressuring them to some extent or being more vocal, but first you have to know what's going on. So how can we be more aware of what is happening, whether it's in our neighborhood or the larger city of Dallas?
Facebook groups. I mean, it sounds so simple that it couldn't possibly be an effective tool, but it still is. From an organizing perspective, Facebook groups, I'm monitoring Facebook groups across Dallas every day, and I get notifications when new posts come up in those groups, particularly Floral Farms, which is where Shingle Mountain was, West Dallas One, which is a coalition of the neighborhood in West Dallas, Southern Sector Rising is another one as well. And yeah, Jessica's right. Yeah, go to read the city council meeting minutes, things like that. There's tons of stuff in the comments. But your neighborhood Facebook pages will always have kind of the highlights. And then you can pick and choose which city council meetings you think are going to be really beneficial, where there might be a big case coming up. Like I can't even remember, but West Dallas was fighting a new tower that was against all of the zoning regulations and anything that had been built out in a comprehensive the comprehensive land use plan.
Mm-hmm.
And because I was watching, Dallas Free Press and some of the smaller media outlets,
Mm-hmm.
I was able to say, oh, like, here's one issue and they need people to talk about it. And so I knew, okay, that's a city plan commission meeting. I'm going to need to register for a comment, and I'm going to need to show up. But I don't go to many others unless I know there's a specific issue that any of those kinds of neighborhoods are talking about, because they're living it. And so they know best. So I try to do best I can to listen to what they're saying and keep a pulse on that. Even the city of Garland, I'm doing some work. So just northeast of Lake Highlands. Garland,
I know in Lake Highlands, and it's maybe a little bit more Lakewood. So I'm on the Facebook group East Dallas Greater Good.
Yeah.
So that's one that I'm on. But so really, maybe next door, it's a little iffy, but like specific Facebook groups, and then trying to monitor city council. I think the challenge is, so, you talked about helping preserve 10th Street, and that we actually need to change the policy. So then the question becomes, what has to happen to change the policy? Right. Because there's a policy, but probably none of the rest of us knew it until we read the book or you shared that with us.
Right. And I don't know if I have a great answer for that. Because as I was trying to think about an answer for that question, think about the process for how I've come to learn about these specific types of policies, and it's always when I'm in conversation with people, and it's in my expanded network of neighbors, because that's where the conversations happen.
Right.
That's where you hear about things. That's the water cooler, if you will, of Dallas. And sometimes, NBC5 or Channel 8 or whatever, sometimes they'll pick something up. Most of the time they won't. Same thing with the Dallas Morning News. And so a lot of times your Dallas Free Press, your Dallas Weekly, a lot of these smaller, primarily minority voiced news outlets are going to give you at least a couple of days lead, sometimes the only lead,
right,
on a lot of these issues. And that's a lot of times where you're going to hear those voices that are often left out of the main narratives. And then eventually they may pop up on a Dallas Morning News type coverage. But even then, even if you're only listening to Dallas Morning News, other major media outlets, there's some questions that I think are helpful to continue asking, that may help dig a little bit deeper. So always asking, who is at the table for this decision? Who has the power in this decision? Who stands to benefit in the long term? And then who's going to bear any of the burdens from these decisions? And I think if you can use that kind of framework for critically asking questions and critically evaluating anything that's going on at a local level or even a state level or federal level, a lot of times that has kind of led me down paths of seeking out information that's ultimately led me to know a little bit more about whatever that topic may be. So those are the main things. I'm always questioning who's at the table and who has the power.
I think that's a really helpful framework. Speaking of frameworks, in the second half of the book, you start talking about space and patterns of justice. And so you have a chapter called Space, Place, and Justice. And you reference the work of a Black architect, Dr. Craig Wilkins, and he has a reconception of space. So can you explain to the LHAMAR members a little bit about this concept and how it supports Brown and Black people?
Yeah. And this was a hard chapter for me to write. It was my favorite chapter because I absolutely love Dr. Wilkins' book. It's fantastic. And I probably don't even do it justice in my own book. But he kind of breaks down these ideas of space and how we've come to know about space. And talks about this idea of like, do we define space? Do we define a classroom because it's the name that's on the plate? Because someone has said this is a classroom. And so therefore we have given it meaning because of that. So it's very top down. You know, this thing didn't have meaning until we said it was a classroom. And so kind of goes through expanding that and ultimately gets to this, you know, and talks about like, well, things at the center are of value and things at the margins are less valuable. And then Bell Hooks, he introduces Bell Hooks' work, and Bell Hooks is a Black feminist writer. It is incredible if you've read any of her stuff. And she basically flips everything on top of its head, as Bell Hooks always does, and says, well, just because something is at the margins, does that mean it's not any good? Or that means it's, oh gosh, just because something is at the margins doesn't mean it's not good. And so what Wilkins kind of says in that is that Hooks is basically saying Black people and minority communities still have power and agency over that space, even though someone else has deemed it marginal by some socially constructed standard. There is still agency and power and creation that can happen in that space. And so it basically says everything at the margin is now at the center and is now the thing which everything else must be judged by. So it's just, it's this absolute inversion of kind of this traditional concept. And I love it so much, and I never really know how to explain it as well as she does. But I think that holds a lot of true, and it goes back to this asset-based and deficit-based language that we use, constantly judging, you know, South Dallas against North Dallas, and West Dallas against North Dallas. But now that I've had the chance to spend more time in both of those neighborhoods, I'm like, we are doing such an injustice. There's so much going on in these neighborhoods that we have no right to be judging them as less than something else. And so that's kind of that conception of space that he talks about, this just absolute inversion of who defines and who controls and says what's good about a marginal space. Right.
So going on in the second half of the book, moving from space, you talk about patterns. And in Dallas, you identified what you call patterns of injustice. So the highways, public housing projects, zoning, eminent domain abuses. And then you counter that with some work by Toni Griffin, who has a framework for changing patterns. And I'm assuming she has a concept called just city. So what is a just city? How can, for instance, the community of Fair Park find their agency in using a just city concept to change our patterns, not just, you know, the Fair Park community, but as a whole? How can we become a just city, and what is that?
Yeah, so a just city is one where everyone's voice has the power and the ability and the opportunity to shape that space. And when you don't have that, you're not working towards a just city. And so a lot of the just city framework hinges on these community listening sessions, or community meetings, if you will, and going through and identifying what you think about your neighborhood and then what you'd like to see changed about your neighborhood. and then identifying what are these things that you see that aren't working great? What are these patterns of injustice that are negatively affecting your neighborhood? And then developing a counteractive pattern of justice to counteract that. And it's just, for examples, like creating a land bridge over a highway to fix, a division, things like that. Creating community markets where, things like that are small scale interventions that a neighborhood can take on. And what it resembles a lot is a neighborhood plan, which is a zoning document that neighborhoods can take part in. Not much anymore. That's a whole other can of worms to talk about, but the city of Dallas has nixed that now that communities of color are starting to develop their own neighborhood-led plans. The city of Dallas has suddenly said, you know what, that's actually not a part of our process anymore. And so we're not going to allow you to submit a neighborhood plan to dictate what you'd like to see in your neighborhood. But that's the kind of document and thing, is this community visioning practice, and really defining, how do we see creativity? How do we see joy? How do we see all of these beneficial parts of community coming forth into the built environment? What does that look like? And what ways can we go about creating these patterns of justice that directly counteract these patterns of injustice? And the first part of that is identifying what those patterns of injustice are and naming them, so that you can then work to actively dismantle them piece by piece.
Right. And that makes me think of Shingle Mountain. So Shingle Mountain happened because there wasn't zoning in place to prevent it.
Right.
So kind of your thoughts on how do you use a just city to prevent, if you will, a Shingle Mountain, right, happening in a low income area? And then, we have a tendency to characterize, back to language, things as good or as bad. So Shingle Mountain is bad, and a concrete company or concrete site is bad. And yet, as a city, we have waste, we have construction needs, we have industrial needs. So how do you find a balance to support industrial uses without hurting people, without hurting their lungs, without hurting their land values, without being a NIMBY, not in my backyard. So kind of your thoughts on that.
Boy,
sorry, that was a lot. So
they're such good questions, and it's like all stuff that I'm like actively engaged in on a daily basis. So I'm trying to synthesize like the stuff that I'm working on every day, because I'm working in West Dallas to help get rid of a grandfathered shingle factory that is spewing 156 tons of sulfur dioxide into the neighborhood and 200 pounds of particulate matter into the air, directly across the street from a school and a church and all these other things. And this is the same neighborhood that had a lead smelter that they tried to get rid of. And they did get rid of in the 1980s. It was the largest Superfund site in the country, 14 square miles. And Shingle Mountain's a very similar story. It's like you have these incongruent zoning things, and there's no buffer. And so kind of what I was talking about, the Floral Farms neighborhood is working right now to produce a neighborhood-led plan. That's when they found out the city no longer accepted neighborhood-led plans. When they started submitting one and said, hey, now that you've bought this land, we want it turned into a park. We want to create a buffer between us and the McComas landfill. We want to create these areas so that we are not surrounded by industry, and at least as closely as we are now. And I think that's one thing. It's like West Dallas, they know, they're like, we don't want to, we're not anti-business, we're not anti-industry. We just don't want you spewing hundreds of tons of particulate matter into our neighbors' lungs every year. And so it's a tough battle for neighborhoods, if I'm being just brutally honest, especially when doors like being able to submit a neighborhood-led plan or other kinds of underlying zoning efforts, when those are closed, it makes it really difficult to have any sort of procedural justice to creating those safe zones of a quarter mile or whatever it is to get safe enough away from any of these industrial polluters. And so at that point, when those kinds of things are shut down, then you have to mobilize, and you have to build the coalitions. I talk about that some in the Shingle Mountain chapter, that building a coalition is highly important. That's what a lot of these neighborhoods are doing. They're building massive coalitions across South and West Dallas to answer these very questions. And we're kind of trying to figure out as we go, how are we going to make these zoning changes to get rid of this stuff, but also make sure that, like you said, it doesn't end up somewhere else in somebody else's neighborhood. Because that's not fair either. And that's not a just city, to just move it to some other place. So I think it's a hard and long conversation. Some of it also has to do with what kind of industries are we promoting, and should we have a larger conversation about what kind of industries we're going to have making the goods and the infrastructure and the things for our cities and our daily lives. So it extends beyond just zoning and neighborhoods and that kind of stuff, and asks larger questions about what do we value as a society, and what externalities are we willing to accept on our neighbors for the sake of whatever we may need.
So you kind of wrap up the book, the last couple of chapters, talking about gentrification and then reinvestment in development. And I chuckled as I was reading your chapter on gentrification, because you wanted it to be all bad, and your research discovered that it really wasn't all bad. Doesn't mean it's all good either. So specifically, when we think about South Dallas, you also mentioned like the Trinity Groves area. How can those populations, those neighborhoods, advocate for gentrifying itself without being driven from their homes, right? So like the home value goes up and they can't stay. So improving your neighborhood, whether it's a food desert or whether it's nicer homes, is not a bad thing in itself. But a lot of times there's unintended consequences, and sometimes intended consequences, like when you have like white developers come in. So to summarize the question, how can neighborhoods advocate for gentrifying without being driven out of their neighborhood, and what would that look like?
Yeah, again, these are really good questions.
I'm in my professor mode.
Yeah, very much so. And I think there are a lot of options. I think there are ways to, for South Dallas to build up. A lot of it is access to capital. It's as simple as that in a lot of cases. And creating space for small scale entrepreneurship, so that it's an easy on-ramp. Even with like my mom and I's cookie bakery, like we had the ability to start out as a cottage bakery when we expanded to farmers markets, and then started renting commercial kitchen space. And so it's like we had that kind of pathway to storefront, had we so chosen to go that route. And those pathways don't exist in South Dallas. There aren't the same types of spaces available to, you know, commercial kitchen space is hard to get a hold of. And so creating those types of things, and that's why I draw so much on Monty Anderson's incremental development framework, which really tries to build those smaller scale development patterns so that people have an opportunity at a lower risk business venture to get things going.
I'm going to ask, there was a comment that flashed up on the screen, and Anne was thinking the same thing I was about microloans, right? So I know I've donated money for microloans to people in Africa and Asia.
Sure.
Are you aware of any cities or any programs that are US based that provide microloans or incremental capital? Because if we could offer that in Dallas in an effective way, again, to give people what they need to get started. So just didn't know if that was anything you were aware of or had thoughts on that.
I'm not aware of anything like that. I didn't research that too far into the microloan stuff necessarily. But I think another piece of it is even not necessarily at the microloan level, but just at the institutional banking level of having banks in South Dallas that are lending money, which is just another issue because banks will loan small amounts, but there's no access to those banks in South and West Dallas. So that's another issue as well. But I do think something like that is a potential, model. It's, a lot of these businesses, especially if you're working with a smaller square footage to start a business, there's very low overhead to run some of these things, to set up a farmer's market tent and then rent some small space out of kind of a manufacturing hub with a bunch of other people that are also doing and creating and building things. And Monty's seen a lot of success with that in Duncanville and DeSoto. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for those similar models in South Dallas. And, when I think about I-345 being removed and all those people are they're driving north to get to jobs because those are the only places where the jobs are in Frisco and Allen, and there's no public transit. And it's like, well, maybe, we can remove I-345, but well, let's start by creating more jobs in South Dallas first, and then maybe we don't need it at all. And I think we can do that in small and incremental ways. It's not these huge injections of cash that are going to save the day. It's not tax abatements, because that does nothing to increase the wealth of Dallas overall, let alone the people that need it. And so by keeping the development in the hands of the residents of the neighborhoods, creates more pride, it creates more local wealth, and all of that is a huge benefit for not only the neighborhood, but for the city. And then there's land trusts for protecting the affordable housing. It's another tool that can be used. And we're seeing a little bit more of that. I don't know if we've seen it in Dallas yet, but that is a model that's being used. So basically, a co-op, a community will buy the land, build a house on top of it, and then rent that house out, lease it out to someone for a flat kind of fee, and sell it out. And then when the person sells the house, they agree to sell it back at a small profit, but it kind of maintains that affordable housing in the long run, protects some of the neighbors from that kind of overinflated housing prices, as we've all seen in the past year and a half.
Yeah. So we just have a few minutes left.
Yeah.
Key takeaway. So for our LHAMAR members, who are activists and fighting racism, what is a key takeaway that you want them to get from your book?
I would say the biggest thing I want people to come away from this with is Dallas and other cities are built on a racialized geography, and we absolutely have to understand that context and the patterns of justice that are replicated through that geography. And the more we understand those patterns of racism, inequality, and disenfranchisement, the easier it is to dismantle those systems in our everyday lives. And kind of like a broken record, like getting to know, following all the other neighborhood groups, getting outside of your neighborhood, those kinds of small steps, asking those questions of who is at the table and who's in power. Those are very small changes. They can have massive effects in how you view and see and operate within the city. And that's half the battle, is just knowing those things. So
Great. Okay, members, if you've been waiting to ask a question, this is your chance. So if anybody wants to just unmute, I'll give you a minute. Tick tock, tick tock. Go ahead, Jessica.
Well, mine's more of a comment and question, and it's more so the question to all those here who are listening. So first off, I'm going to say thank you to everybody coming and listening to this conversation. It's very important that we speak more about these struggles that are happening right now. You know, Shingle Mountain, it's not too far from, I mean, we're there. I was in a panel with Miss Jackson just recently, and so they're still battling that over there. There's other developments that have happened that they're trying so hard to prevent from Shingle Mountain happening again. But now that we have this knowledge, what are we going to do with it? You know, that's what I would always, when I find out about something new, is that acknowledgement that, okay, now I know this is happening here in the city of Dallas. What are we going to do now with this knowledge? You know, because that's, I think, where we stay stagnant. And we know this is happening, but now what are we going to do with it? So that's what I'm going to challenge all of you now with, is what are you going to do with this knowledge? How are you going to help the BIPOC community in their fight? How are you going to be an ally in their fight? So that's my question. It's a more of a reflection. It's not something you need to answer like right now.
Thank you, Jessica. I think Jennifer unmuted. Did you have a comment or question?
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to say, you know, thank you for putting this on the group, because I wouldn't have ever heard about this book if it wasn't for you guys putting it on the group. And thank you for writing it, Collin. And I've never looked at the city of Dallas map with such scrutiny as I have since reading the book. Like, I mean, the whole time we've been sitting here and you talk about different neighborhoods, I'm like going and zooming in on parts of the city, and it gives a different perspective of our city. And I think to answer your question, Jessica, is just to share the information with people that I know that don't know this, right? Like, share the book. Unfortunately, I got the Kindle version, and so I can't like hand it to people. So I may just go buy a regular version and then hand that one out to people. But I think it would be helpful, right, for more people to really understand the history, and just as we drive around the city, think about what was there before and what's happened, and just it's just not something that I've ever thought about in our city. You know, what was underneath those highways. I've never ever crossed my mind. But it's interesting because the one time I was in like Europe, and you see the different layers of a city, right? You go to Troy and there's like 7 layers and they just built on top of it. Like, you just never think that kind of stuff is happening here, right? That's over there. And so I just thank you for it. I appreciate it. I'm still reading. I'm not done with the book yet. So I'll be looking for volume 2.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. That's exactly, I think, our goal is to make ourselves think differently. I am also going to follow up with Collin to get his list of Facebook groups, and we'll post that on LHAMAR so we can all be more aware of what is happening throughout the city. So Collin, thank you again for writing the book, for being excessive in your one class, and being curious and leading to change. So thank you again for your time and your patience in answering all these questions.
Absolutely. Thank y'all so much for having me. Yeah, it just means everything to be able to talk to. I wrote this book primarily to talk to people who are like me, who didn't have to think, like you were saying, Jennifer, who didn't have to think about these things, because the city was built for white people to not have to think about any of this. So I'm grateful that it's getting out into my own back door, so we can start talking about this and start making change.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. We'll be getting the video posted in the next day or two, so encourage other members to come watch it. Don't tell them it's 90 minutes long. But there's a lot of content, so we really wanted to cover it. So thank you again. Thank you, Collin. Thank you, Jessica, for your help. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Yvette. Thank you, Collin.
Thank you.